The 44th floor conference room at Aldervane Media Group had a nameplate on the door that read Vinterm Suite, and I remember thinking it was strange that a room could have a better title than the people forced to sit in it. Theo von Marke stood at the head of the table, mid-sentence, his laser pointer sweeping across a chart of his division's projected growth. He hadn't looked up when I entered. He was still talking when he finally did. For a moment, half a second, no more, his face did nothing. Then it started to come apart, quietly, the way a screen glitches before it goes dark. He knew my face. He just couldn't place it in this room. 3 years ago, Theo von Marke had walked me to an elevator and told me I didn't have the range for leadership. He'd said it kindly, the way people are cruel when they think they'll never see you again. Today he was presenting to the board that had just acquired his company, and I was sitting on that board. The fountain pen my mother left me is a Sheffer with a hairline crack near the nib, and I turned it over in my fingers the morning I signed my resignation from Castellane Networks, 3 years and 1 month before I would sit on the board that owned it. I remember the crack because I kept running my thumb along it while Theo von Marke explained, with enormous patience, why the company no longer had a place for me. Patience was his cruelty. He never raised his voice. He just spoke to you the way you'd speak to a child who had wandered into a room full of adults. My name is Renata Kowalska, and for 9 years, I was the Chief Content Officer of Castellane Networks, a mid-sized media company that ran 4 cable channels, a streaming platform, and a syndication arm that licensed our documentary catalog to distributors across 3 continents. When I joined, Castellane was a regional broadcaster with a single aging channel and a library nobody had bothered to digitize. By the time Theo arrived, we were a $600 million a year operation with the most valuable factual content archive in the market. I built that archive. Not alone. Nobody builds anything alone. But the strategy was mine, the acquisitions were mine, the relationships with the distributors who paid us every quarter were mine. Theo came in as CEO after the founder, Aurel Castellane, stepped back for health reasons. Aurel had hired me himself, over lunch at a restaurant where he spent more time talking about my mother's country than about the job. He was old world in a way that felt genuine rather than performed. He believed in people slowly and completely. When he told me, near the end, that he was handing the company to a modern operator, I understood what he meant. Theo was 41, immaculate, fluent in the language of margins and synergies, and utterly convinced that anything built before his arrival was a liability to be managed. Our first real conversation happened on the 44th floor, in a glass-walled office that looked out over the harbor. Theo had redecorated it within a week of arriving, stripped Aurel's bookshelves, replaced them with a single abstract sculpture and a lot of empty space. He liked empty space. He said it communicated confidence. "Renata," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "Walk me through the content org. Simple version." I walked him through it. The acquisitions team, the licensing desk, the archive, the relationships with our 3 largest distributors, one in the north, one across the Atlantic, one in a market most of our competitors couldn't crack. I explained that 2 of those distributor contracts came up for renewal every 18 months, and that both distributors renewed every time because they trusted the people, not the paperwork. He listened with his head tilted, the way a man listens when he's already decided you're describing something more complicated than it needs to be. "So it's relationships," he said. "That's the whole moat. Relationships." "That's most moats," I said. He smiled. "Relationships don't scale, Renata. That's the problem with how this place was built. It's a beautiful little cottage industry. I'm here to turn it into a machine." I should have understood in that moment exactly how this was going to end. But I'd survived 3 CEOs in my career, and I'd learned that men who talk about machines usually break themselves against the parts they don't understand. I decided to be patient. Patience, I would learn, was a game 2 people could play. For the first year, Theo mostly left content alone. He was busy elsewhere, cutting the terrestrial division, renegotiating the streaming tech stack, bringing in a consulting firm that produced slide decks thick enough to prop a door. The archive kept earning, the distributors kept renewing. My team kept its head down and did the work. I told myself we were fine. We were not fine. I just couldn't see the shape of it yet. The first sign was small. In a leadership meeting that spring, Theo presented a content efficiency initiative, a plan to reduce the licensing desk from 11 people to 4 and route the distributor relationships through a centralized partnerships function reporting directly to him. He framed it as modernization. He used the word de-risking. What he meant was that he wanted the relationships I'd built to belong to the org chart instead of to me. I pushed back, calmly, in front of the room. I explained that our northern distributor renewed on a handshake with a woman named Sabina Holt, who had worked with my licensing lead for 6 years, and that if you dropped a stranger from a partnerships function into that relationship, you would not be de-risking anything. You would be introducing the single largest risk the company faced. 40% of our recurring revenue ran through relationships that were, at their core, personal. Theo let me finish. Then he said, to the room, not to me, "This is exactly the dependency we need to break. When one person is that important, the company is fragile. I'd rather have a process than a hero." A few people nodded. They always nod. I had learned long ago that nodding costs nothing and disagreeing costs everything, and that most people, most of the time, will choose the thing that costs nothing. I remember driving home that night along the harbor road, the pen in my coat pocket, thinking about the word hero and how he'd used it like an accusation. I wasn't a hero. I was a person who had spent 9 years learning exactly how much of this company was held together by trust that didn't appear on any balance sheet. And now a man was going to try to convert that trust into a process, and he was going to fail. And when he failed, he was going to need someone to blame. I understood then that it was going to be me. So I did something quiet. I called Sabina Holt, and I called our other 2 distributor contacts, and I had 3 long, warm, completely off-the-record conversations. Not about Theo. Not about any of it. Just about how they were doing, what they were worried about, what they'd want from a content partner if things ever changed. I filed those conversations away in my head and told no one. 2 weeks later, Theo scheduled a one-on-one and told me the company was creating a new SVP of Strategic Partnerships role and that the distributor relationships would report into it and that he hoped I understood this wasn't personal. I said I understood perfectly. I did. It was the most honest thing he'd said to me in a year. What I didn't tell him was that I had already started writing down everything. Every renewal date, every unwritten term, every name and preference and history that lived only in my head and in the heads of 3 people who trusted me. I wasn't building a weapon. Not yet. I was just refusing to hand him a map to the thing he didn't know how to read. The invitation to the leadership offsite came with a seating chart attached, and I noticed my name wasn't on it before I noticed anything else. 200 people were flying to a resort 3 hours south for Castellane's annual strategy summit. I had presented at every one of these for 9 years. This time, the content slot on the agenda simply read, Partnerships, Theo van Marke. I went anyway. I told myself it was a scheduling oversight. It was not a scheduling oversight. The main session was held in a ballroom with the hotel's crystal chandeliers dimmed to a corporate gray. Theo stood at the podium in front of a slide titled "The End of Dependency." He clicked through a graph showing our revenue concentration, the 40% that ran through my 3 distributor relationships, colored an alarming red, like a wound on an X-ray. "For too long," he said, "this company has been hostage to a handful of personal relationships. One person leaves, and we're exposed. That's not a business, that's a hobby." He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. Everyone in that room knew whose relationships those were. I felt the heat climb my neck, and I kept my face still. I had learned stillness the way other people learn a language, through years of necessary practice. Then he did the thing I hadn't expected. He put up a new slide, an org chart. The new strategic partnerships function sat at the top, reporting to him, and beneath it, in a smaller box, in gray text, was a single line: Content Advisory, R. Kowalska. Advisory. He had demoted me on a slide, in front of 200 people, before saying a word to me directly. My 9 years, the archive I'd built, the 4-continent licensing network, reduced to a gray box labeled Advisory, hanging off the bottom of his org chart like an afterthought he was too polite to delete. Someone near the front laughed. Not cruelly, nervously, the laugh people make when they're relieved it isn't them. Theo smiled toward the sound. "Renata's been a tremendous historian for this company," he said, finding my table with his eyes for the first time. "But we're building a future, not a museum, and the future doesn't run on favors." Historian. I have been called many things in boardrooms. That one landed somewhere new. I did not stand up. I did not object. I picked up the water glass in front of me and took a slow sip, because a hand holding a glass cannot shake visibly, and I wanted my hands to have a job. Around my table, my own team, the licensing people who hadn't yet been consolidated, stared at the tablecloth. One of them, a young analyst named Iva Renner, glanced at me with something like grief. I gave her the smallest nod. Not now. Not here. The rest of the day passed the way these things do. Breakout sessions, forced networking, a dinner where people who'd watched me get demoted on a slide came up to tell me how much they respected my legacy. Legacy is what people call your work when they've decided it's over. I flew home that night instead of staying for the second day. In the car from the airport, I finally let myself feel it. Not the humiliation, which was almost boring in its predictability, but the specific insult of the word advisory. Theo had made a decision. He was going to move the distributor relationships into his new function whether the distributors liked it or not, and he was going to keep me on as a decorative advisor so the transition looked orderly, so nobody could say he'd fired the woman who built the archive. He wanted the relationships without the person. He wanted the machine without the hero. The next morning, I came into the office early. The 44th floor was empty except for the cleaning staff and the low hum of the building waking up. I sat at my desk and opened my email, and there it was, a calendar invite for a content transition planning meeting. Sender: Theo's chief of staff, a sharp, ambitious man named Sebastian Voss, who had transferred in from consulting and treated every conversation like a deposition. The invite listed the agenda: handover of key partner relationships to strategic partnerships function. My role in the meeting was listed as optional. I clicked accept anyway. I wanted to be in the room when they tried to hand my relationships to a stranger. The meeting was 3 days later, in the glass conference room they called the Vinterm Suite, the same room where, years from now, I would sit on the other side of everything. Sebastian ran it. Theo dropped in for the first 15 minutes to set the frame, then left for something more important, which was his way of communicating that this was beneath him. The goal: Sebastian said, sliding a document across the table, is a clean transfer of the 3 anchor distributor accounts to the central function by end of quarter. Renata, we'll need you to make warm introductions to your contacts. Sabina Holt at the Northern Group and the 2 others. Just an email. Meet your new partnership team. That kind of thing. I looked at the document. It was a transition plan, meticulous, full of milestones and owners. It assumed the distributors were assets that belonged to Castellane and could be reassigned like desks. You understand these renew on 18-month cycles, I said, and that the 2 largest are up for renewal in the next 4 months. We're aware, Sebastian said, in the tone of a man who was not aware. And you understand that the renewals aren't automatic. They're negotiated, on trust, which is exactly why we're centralizing them, he said. So the company owns the trust, not an individual. I almost laughed. You cannot centralize trust. Trust is not a database. But I had stopped arguing with these men out loud a long time ago. Arguing gives them the satisfaction of overruling you. Silence gives you room to work. Of course, I said. I'll send the introductions. Sebastian looked faintly surprised at how easy it had been. He shouldn't have been. I had every intention of sending those introductions. I just knew something he didn't. That Sabina Holt and the 2 contacts across the 2 oceans would read a "Meet your new team" email from me and understand it exactly for what it was. A signal that I was being pushed out. And I knew what each of them would do next, because I had spent 9 years earning the right to know. That evening, after the floor emptied, I stayed late. I opened a blank document and for the first time, I started writing down what I would need if I ever chose to walk. Not the leverage. I already knew where that lived. Just the shape of a plan. The renewal dates, the names, the order in which things would fall if the wrong hand touched them. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had burned off somewhere over the harbor on the flight home. What was left was colder and more useful. Theo thought he was removing a dependency. He had no idea he was about to prove exactly how much the company depended on the one person he'd just labeled advisory. Let me pause here for a moment, because this is where the story turns, and I want you with me for it. Have you ever been reduced to a footnote on someone else's slide, labeled advisory, historian, legacy, by a person who never once asked how the thing they were dismantling actually worked? If you have, tell me in the comments what word they used on you. I read everyone. And if you believe the quietest person in the room is often the one holding the only key that matters, subscribe and stay with me. Because what happened after I sent those 3 introduction emails is where Theo's version of events stops being true. I sent the 3 introduction emails on a Thursday morning, exactly as Sebastian Voss had asked. Each one was warm, professional, and completely correct. I'd like to introduce you to Castellane's new strategic partnerships team, who will be your primary contacts going forward. I CC'd Sebastian on all 3. I did everything by the book. What I understood, and what nobody on the 44th floor understood, was that those 3 emails were not introductions. They were signals. And the people receiving them knew exactly how to read a signal, because I had taught them, over 9 years, how to read me. Sabina Holt called me 2 days later. Not the office line, my personal cell, the number I'd given her years earlier when a licensing dispute nearly cost her distributor a marquee documentary series, and I'd stayed up until 4 a.m. rewriting the terms so both sides could live with them. She'd never forgotten that. People remember who was awake at 4 a.m. for them. Renata, she said. No preamble. What's happening over there? A reorganization, I said. I'm being moved to an advisory role. There was a pause. Advisory. That's the word. Another pause, longer. Then, and these partnership people, they renew our contract in March? That's the plan. I've worked with Castellane for 6 years, Sabina said. I've never once worked with Castellane. I've worked with you. You understand the difference. I don't think your new CEO does. I did understand the difference. It was the entire difference. It was the thing Theo had drawn on a slide in red and called a dependency to be broken. What he never grasped was that the dependency didn't run from the company to me. It ran from the distributors to me. Castellane didn't own those relationships any more than a stadium owns the crowd. And the two largest contracts, Sabina's Northern Group and the Transatlantic Distributor, came up for renewal within 4 months of each other. Together, they were roughly 40% of Castellane's recurring revenue, not a rounding error, a load-bearing wall. Here is the mechanism Theo never bothered to learn, the detail that would eventually undo him. Those renewals were not automatic. They were not evergreen contracts that rolled over unless someone objected. Years earlier, when I first structured them, I had deliberately made them manual. Each renewal required a fresh negotiation and a counter-signature every cycle. My own board at the time had questioned it. Why introduce friction? Why not lock the distributors in with auto-renew? Because, I'd argued, auto-renew makes you lazy, and lazy is how you lose a relationship without noticing. Manual renewal forced us to earn the business every 18 months. It kept us honest. It kept us close. It also meant that if the person the distributors trusted was gone when the renewal window opened, there was nothing to roll over. The contract simply ended on schedule, and both parties had to choose, from scratch, whether to sign again. And a distributor who felt that the company had just discarded the one human being who understood their business had a very natural way to express that feeling. They could simply decline to re-sign. No lawsuit, no breach, no drama. Just quiet non-renewal, and 40% of the revenue walking out the door on a date already circled in everyone's calendar. I hadn't built that structure as a weapon. I'd built it as good practice, 9 years before I'd ever heard the name Theo van Marke. But good structure, it turns out, protects the people who built it, whether they planned it or not. I want to be precise about what I did and didn't do, because it matters. I did not tell Sabina to walk. I did not tell the Transatlantic Distributor to walk. I did not orchestrate anything. When Sabina asked me, point blank, should we re-sign in March? I told her the truth. That's a business decision only you can make. I'd never advise you against your own interests. Which was itself the most damning thing I could have said, and we both knew it. Because for 6 years my advice had always started with, here's what's good for both of us. The absence of that phrase told her everything. Then I did the only strategic thing I permitted myself. I documented every renewal date, every unwritten term, every preference and history and grievance that lived only in my head. I wrote it all into a single confidential file, not to keep it from Castellane, to make sure that when the renewals failed, no one could claim I had sabotaged them by withholding information. The file was my alibi and my armor. It proved I had handed over everything a competent partnership's function would need. If they still lost the accounts, it wouldn't be because I'd hidden the map. It would be because a stranger cannot inherit 6 years of 4 a.m. phone calls by reading a spreadsheet. The first sign of trouble reached the 44th floor about 3 weeks later. I heard it secondhand from Iva Renner, the young analyst who still sat near what used to be my team. She came to my new, smaller office. Advisory offices are always smaller, that's part of the message, and closed the door. The March renewal, she said quietly. Sabina's group. They haven't returned the partnership team's calls in 8 days. Sebastian's people are starting to panic. They keep asking where the renewal playbook is. There isn't a playbook, I said. There was never a playbook. There was a person. Eva looked at me for a long moment. She was 26, sharp, and had watched me demoted on a slide in front of 200 people. "They're going to come to you," she said. "When it gets bad enough, they're going to walk down here and ask you to fix it." "I know," I said. "What are you going to do?" I thought about the fountain pen in my drawer, the one with the hairline crack. I thought about the word historian. I thought about a man who had looked at 40% of a company's revenue and seen an inefficiency instead of a miracle. "I'm going to tell them the truth," I said. "That's all. I'm going to tell them exactly how it works, and then I'm going to let them decide whether they still think relationships don't scale." 2 floors up, Sebastian Voss was already drafting the email that would summon me. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to learn the difference between owning a contract and owning the trust that made the contract worth signing. Theo had spent a year trying to convert one into the other. In 4 months, the calendar was going to show him the exchange rate. The summons came, as Iva had predicted, in the form of an email from Sebastian Voss with the subject line, "Urgent. Renewal support requested." The word support was doing a great deal of work. 19 days earlier, I had been an advisory footnote. Now I was support. Titles, I have learned, are just weather. They change with the season and tell you nothing about the climate. They held the meeting in the Vinterm suite. Sebastian was there, gray-faced. 2 of his partnership hires sat with laptops open and nothing useful on the screens. And Theo came this time. He did not drop in for 15 minutes and leave. He sat at the head of the table for the entire hour, which was how I knew the situation was already worse than anyone in that room had admitted out loud. "Renata," Theo said. He tried for warmth. It landed somewhere near a smile you'd give a dentist. "Thank you for joining. We've hit some friction with the renewals. Sabina Holt's group has gone quiet. The transatlantic account, too. We think it's a communication gap. We'd like you to reopen the channels." I set my hands flat on the table. The Sheffer pen was in my jacket pocket. I could feel it against my ribs. "What have they told you?" Sebastian answered. "Nothing. That's the problem. Sabina's not returning calls. Her deputy says the renewal is under review. The transatlantic group sent a 2-line email saying they're evaluating options for the coming cycle." "And the contracts?" Sebastian hesitated. "They lapse on schedule if unsigned. March 11th for Sabina's group. April 2nd for the transatlantic account." "Manual renewal," I said. "No auto rollover. Both of them." "Yes." He said it like a man reading his own sentencing. I looked at Theo. "You presented a slide at the offsite, the end of dependency. You colored 40% of this company's revenue red and called it a risk to be eliminated. Do you remember what I told you in this exact room 18 months ago?" He didn't answer. "I told you those renewals aren't automatic. I told you they run on trust, and that trust is attached to people, not to the org chart. You called it a cottage industry. You said you'd rather have a process than a hero." I let that sit. "So here we are. You have your process. Where is it?" One of the partnership hires, a young man who had done nothing wrong except be hired into an impossible job, cleared his throat. "The relationships were supposed to transfer with the accounts, the playbook." "There is no playbook," I said, not unkindly. There was never a playbook. There was a woman named Sabina Holt who trusted a woman named Iva Renner's manager, who was me, because I stayed awake until 4 a.m. 6 years ago, rewriting a licensing schedule so her company wouldn't lose a series it had already announced. That's not in a document. You can't inherit it. You tried to reassign it like a parking space. Theo's jaw tightened. "So fix it. That's why you're here." And there it was. The thing he still didn't understand. He thought I was here to be used. He thought advisory meant available. He thought that because he held the title of CEO, the trust would flow wherever he pointed it. I can't fix it, I said. Not the way you mean. I can't call Sabina Holt and tell her Castellane is a wonderful partner and she should re-sign, because I no longer believe it's true, and she'd hear the lie in the first sentence. She's known me for 6 years. She knows exactly what an advisory title means. She knew the moment I sent that introduction email that I was being pushed to the door. And she made a decision, her own decision, one I did not ask her to make. What decision? Theo's voice had lost its warmth entirely. I took a breath. This was the moment I had documented for. 2 weeks ago, Sabina Holt's group signed a 3-year exclusive with Aldervane Media Group. Aldervane took the northern distribution rights and the archive licensing relationship. The transatlantic account is finalizing a similar agreement with the same buyer. Together, those two contracts represent roughly 41% of Castellane's recurring revenue. As of March 11th and April 2nd, that revenue does not lapse quietly and sit waiting for you to recover it. It has already moved. It's gone. The room went very still. Sebastian's laptop had gone to sleep. The screen was a black mirror. Theo stared at me. You did this. No, I said. You did this. You drew the slide. You broke the dependency. I simply told the truth to people who asked me a direct question, and I documented every renewal date and every unwritten term and handed them to your partnership function so that no one could ever say I withheld a thing. I slid a printed folder across the table, my confidential file, the one I'd built as armor. It's all in there. Everything a competent team would need. They still lost the accounts, because the accounts were never yours to lose. Here is the part I want you to understand, because it is the whole story. There was no dollar figure. There was no check written to me, no equity buyback, no windfall. The stakes were never money, not for me. Theo could count the revenue that walked out the door. 41%, a number he would have to explain to a board that had already lost patience with him. But my victory wasn't the number. My victory was the moment a man who had called me a historian and a dependency and a cottage industry sat in a glass room and understood that the thing he had dismissed as sentiment was the only load-bearing wall in the building, and that he had knocked it down himself with a laser pointer in front of 200 people while I sat silent and let him. You'll destroy the company, Theo said. His voice had gone quiet and fast, the register men reach for when they've stopped arguing and started bargaining. The board will see revenue collapse, jobs, people's livelihoods. Is that what you want? To burn it all down over a slide? I didn't burn anything, I said. I stopped holding it up. There's a difference, though I understand why it's hard for you to see it from where you're sitting. I stood. I put on my coat. You spent 18 months trying to convert trust into process. You should have asked the one question that mattered. What happens to the trust in the gap between the two? I could have told you. I did tell you. You called it a museum. Sebastian wouldn't look up. The two partnership hires looked like men who had just realized they'd been sold a map to a country that didn't exist. Theo tried one more time, and this is the part I remember most clearly because it was the moment the whole reversal completed itself. He stood too, and he said, not to me, but to the room, the old reflex, always to the room. This is exactly the fragility I warned about. One person leaves and everything... Yes, I said, cutting across him for the first time in 3 years. That's exactly the fragility you warned about. You were right about the risk. You were just wrong about who it protected. I walked out of the Vinterm suite. Behind me, the room stayed silent. Not the nervous silence of the off-site, where 200 people had laughed to be sure it wasn't them. This was a different silence. This was the silence of people doing arithmetic and not liking the answer. I didn't need to hear it. I already knew the sum. The vote to remove Theo van Marke happened on a Tuesday, and I know the day because I was in the room. Not as a witness this time, as a director. The reversal had not been immediate. Corporate collapse rarely is. It moves like water finding cracks in a foundation, slow until it isn't. In the weeks after Sabina Holt's Northern Group and the transatlantic distributor both walked, Castellane's finance team spent long nights trying to model a version of the future where 41% of recurring revenue didn't vanish on 2 dates already circled in the calendar. There was no such version. Theo brought in a second consulting firm to fix the damage the first one had caused. He announced a diversification initiative. He gave an all-hands where he used the word resilience 11 times. I know because Eva Renner counted and texted me the number, followed by a single word. Incredible. What Theo did not know, what none of them knew until it was far too late to matter, was where those 2 distributors had gone. They hadn't drifted to a competitor. They had signed with Aldervane Media Group, a diversified media holding company 3 times Castellane's size, with a factual content strategy that had, for 18 months, been quietly advised by an independent consultant they'd brought on after she left a mid-sized broadcaster under circumstances the acquiring board found very illuminating. That consultant was me. I want to be precise about how the comeback actually worked, because it wasn't magic and it wasn't luck. When Theo pushed me into the advisory box on his org chart, I did not go home and lick my wounds. I took a call I'd been declining politely for 2 years, from a woman named Haldis Merrick, who chaired Aldervane's content committee and had wanted my read on the factual licensing market for a long time. I signed on as an independent advisor. I told them, in plain terms, which distributor relationships in the market were personal rather than institutional, and therefore portable. I did not name Castellane's account specifically. I didn't have to. Haldis Marek had spent 30 years in this business. She understood exactly which relationships I was describing, because I was one of the 2 people alive who had built them. When Castellane's revenue began to crater, Aldervane did what large, patient companies do to small, panicking ones. They made an offer for the whole thing, the channels, the streaming platform, and the crown jewel, the documentary archive I had spent 9 years assembling. Castellane's board, staring at a revenue cliff and a CEO who kept saying resilience, took the deal at a valuation that reflected exactly how much trouble they were in. Aldervane didn't pay a premium for a growth story. They paid a discount for a distressed asset. And as part of the acquisition, Haldis Marek asked me to join Aldervane's board as an independent director, with specific oversight of the newly acquired division. The division that reported, on the new org chart, to the board I now sat on. The divisions still run, for the length of a transition period, by Theo van Marke. Which brings me back to the Vinterm suite, and the morning at the top of this story, the quarterly review where he looked up mid-sentence and finally saw my face in a room he never expected me to enter. He got through his presentation. I'll give him that. His hands weren't steady, but his voice mostly was, and he clicked through his slides about integration synergies and content roadmap alignment, while I sat with the other directors and said nothing, because I had learned a long time ago exactly how much power lives in a woman's silence when a loud man is trying to fill a room. When he finished, Haldis Marek turned to me. Renata, you have oversight on this division. Questions? I had one. 3 years ago, I said, in a room a lot like this one, you told me I didn't have the range for leadership. You said this company needed a machine, not a museum. I've read your integration plan. I set it on the table between us. It's a museum, Theo. It's a beautiful, careful catalog of everything you don't know how to run. The archive you're proposing to optimize is the same archive you called a liability. The distributor strategy you're pitching is the one you spent 18 months dismantling. You're standing here asking this board to fund the rebuilding of the exact thing you broke. He didn't answer. The old reflex, speak to the room, had nowhere left to go, because the room was mine now. The board voted 3 weeks later. Theo's transition role was not renewed. The language in the press release was gentle, the way these things always are, stepping down to pursue other opportunities with gratitude for his contributions. Gratitude is what companies extend to people they are relieved to be rid of. There was no dollar figure at the end of this for me. No buyback, no windfall check, no equity that vested on his exit. I want you to understand that because it's the part that matters most. I didn't win money. I won the org chart. I won the specific, quiet, permanent satisfaction of sitting above a man who had walked me to an elevator and told me I was a historian, and of running, now, the very archive he'd called a museum, at a company big enough to give it the future he never could. The last time I saw him was not a dramatic scene. It was a logistics detail. His assistant needed a signature from the division's oversight director to release his final transition documents, and the oversight director was me. So a form crossed my desk with his name on it, and a line at the bottom for mine. I read it once. Then I picked up my mother's fountain pen, the Sheffer with the hairline crack near the nib. The one I'd been turning over in my fingers the morning I first signed my way out of his company, and I signed him out of it instead. The crack in the nib caught, the way it always does, and left the faintest skip in the ink. I didn't fix it. Some flaws are just proof that a thing has been used for a long time by someone who knew exactly what it was for. I kept the pen. I keep it still. And every quarter, when the archive I built post numbers Theo von Marke never believed were possible, I take it out and sign the report with the same skipping nib, and I think about the difference between a machine and a museum, and about the man who never learned that the most valuable thing in any company is the person everyone assumes is only there to remember how it used to work.